So it is now our difficult job to conclude after these two very rich days. It takes at least two of us to conclude, I think. I say at least because, as you saw in the program, there were three of us in the program. Mercedes, unfortunately, had to go back to the airport, and she apologizes for her absence. But she already started to make a few comments towards the end in the last discussion that can help orient our discussion. I'll try in the first to draw a few tentative conclusions, or at least reflections, based on the exchanges over the last 2 days, and then I'll hand things over to Gerard, who will reflect on how we can try to define European Qur'an, what is the European Qur'an, in the perspective of our evolving project, and then a few last words of thanks and farewell. First of all, a few themes that struck me over the last 2 days. I'm going to talk about naming the Qur'an, about lost in translation, about the otherness of the Qur'an, particularly in comparison with the Bible, about the Qur'an and Muhammad is author of the Qur'an, and evoke a few further questions before I hand things over to Gerard. Naming the Qur'an, is it Al-Qur'an, as one word, Al-Qur'an with this capital C, Qur'an with a K, with a C, Qur'an. Ahmed Mahdi reminded us of the choices of George Sale and the importance for him of affirming the Qur'an, habitually called the Al-Qur'an. So this choice of naming is important. And as Marco Fanelli showed us, it was Qur'an in Greek for Cantacuzenus. So there's the word Qur'an, and then speculation as what the Arabic word Qur'an actually means. A book of precepts, laws, or stories, in some of the texts that Florence Ninit examined. For Ricoldo de Montecroce, it's a collectaneum preceptorum Dei, a collection of precepts of God. It's for Massignon, a compendium of historical anecdotes, as Davide Scotto told us. For Crucentolpo in the 19th century, it's a reading or a readable book. And in the Hebrew translation, it was explained, as Naima explained to us, that Qur'an or Furqan indicates salvation, so he who follows it will be saved. So these are a few reflections on the name of the Qur'an and its meaning. But we saw in many cases that things were lost in translation. Already sometimes there are multiple translations of the same passages in different ways. We saw that with William of Tripoli giving two different translations, the Shahada, as Pierre Courtin explained to us. We also, one of the things that's lost in translation often, and this came up several times, is the oral nature of the Qur'an, the importance of the Qur'an in liturgy, the chanting or singing of the Qur'an. And Naima showed how often the oral aspects, even the words used in the Qur'an involving recitation, were elided or transformed in the translations in Latin, and then, of course, in the Italian, Hebrew, Spanish. And we see this in other translations, too. The Qur'an is seen as a book rather than as a living oral text. And this is true already for Nicetas of Byzantium, as Manolis Ulbricht explained to us, and for many subsequent European readers. Also lost in translation were basic things of the structure of the Quran. How many surahs in the Quran? I mean, Maurizio looked at the various calculations, and sometimes the varying calculations in the same text, trying to figure out how many surahs were in the Quran, trying to figure out how many what the structure of the Qur'an is. And of course, when Castrodaldo's translation incorporates some of the texts from the Corpus Islazimotinum as the first book of 3 books of the Qur'an, that creates confusion for his Italian readers and for those who translate the Italian version into German, into Hebrew, or other languages, as we saw with Maurizio and Naima. Now, the otherness of the Qur'an, and particularly the strangeness of the Qur'an, often implicitly or explicitly compared with the Bible. For William of Tripoli, the Qur'an runs and dances around biblical stories instead of telling them, as Pierre Cotin showed us. The Qur'an's poetic, perceived poetic nature is often underlined either positively or negatively. Negatively, of course, as we saw with Il Re Reginato, for Jean Germain, for Ricoldo de Montecroce, and others. Largely positively, pour Claude Etienne Savary, as Gabriel Reynolds told us, as well as for Goethe and others, and some more ambivalently. And Jan Loop's work has covered this issue of how gradually this poetic dimension to the Qur'an is valued over the course, even if there's a good bit of ambivalence that rests, it becomes a largely positive portrayal of the Qur'an for many European writers starting in the 17th and 18th century. And in the 19th century, Krusenthal talked about the harmonic sound of the Qur'an, which sounds positive, but it's what seduces these people. They're seduced by the sound, which, of course, the Swedish reader will not have that seduction, and as the other readers of European languages won't. Although some translators, such as Savary, try to say, well, I'm going to try in French to communicate this poetic beauty. So this danger, of course, brings us to the idea of the Qur'an as poison, as honey-coated poison, as Jacob told us, because that beauty is seducing, and it, for many of these readers, it poisons. It's the honey that allows the poison of the Qur'an to pass. For Peter of Cluny and for others, as Jacob Yangulo told us. Or, on the contrary, is it poison or is it medicine for Murad bin Abdallah, the Hungarian convert to Islam that Chiara Pietrolini told us? The Qur'an is also seen for some as a tool for language learning, biblical studies, comparative religion, certainly for Tengnagel, as Chiara Pietrolini has showed us, and also for many Orientalist scholars starting in the 16th and particularly in the 17th and 18th century, as Jan Loop and the whole Qur'an, European Qur'an team, particularly in Copenhagen, has been working on. And we have seen how this Catholic and then Protestant negative vision of the Qur'an is largely eliminated in the Hebrew translations, as Naima showed us. Much of this depreciatory material is taken out and presented. The Qur'an is presented in much more positive light by these Jewish authors of the Hebrew and Spanish versions. This moves us to the relation between Qur'an and Muhammad. Muhammad is often presented as the author of the Qur'an. This is already true for John of Damascus in the 8th century, as Manolis showed us. And it's true for Krusenthal in the 19th century, as Nora told us, and it's true for many European writers today. Muhammad is sole author of the Qur'an, or sometimes he gets help from heretical Jews, Nestorians, Arians, etc., heretical Christians, Nestorians, Arians, or from Jews, or from the devil, who's, for some medieval authors, the ultimate author of the Qur'an. And implicitly, sometimes explicitly, Muhammad is contrasted with Jesus. If one wants to attack the Quran, one can do it by denigrating Muhammad as a false prophet, and vice versa. In delegitimizing the Quran, one delegitimizes Muhammad. But Muhammad is also sometimes compared with Moses as lawgivers. Moses is, of course, the legitimate lawgiver who really got those tablets from God in Sinai, whereas Muhammad pretends to have received a law from God. We saw this already in Nicetas of Byzantium, as Manolis showed us, and Roberta showed us various examples, both textual and visual, of this comparison between Moses and Muhammad as lawgivers, true and false. And in well, this brings us to my further sort of concluding questions. Well into the 20th century, medieval Christian readings of the Quran are mobilized in order to forge new readings and responses to the Quran in Islam. Some of them negative, some of them rather positive. Davide talked about Massignon in particular. And as Chiara Petrolini reminded us concerning the Christchurch mosque killings, 20th century far-right extremists are still mobilizing many of these medieval tropes, medieval and early modern anti-Quranic and anti-Muslim tropes. So as we reflect on the European Quran, some of the examples we encountered raise a question. We talked about what is the Quran. We can also talk about what is European, obviously. Particularly when in the periods under study, there's a constant movement between Islam and Christianity and constant shifting boundaries between Christendom and Islam. And we can return to the example of Murad bin Abdallah that Chiara brought up. 16th century Hungarian Christian captured at the Battle of Mohacs, converted to Islam, who presents the Quran, obviously in a very positive light, as we've seen, as medicine. This also is the European Quran, as is Naimbe Frasheri's teachings. The Albanian Quran, in his version, Albanian nationalist Quran, is also a European Quran. And that, I think, gives a nice point of transition to Gerard. So please, Gerard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me, before I continue this discussion, also thank the organizers, the postdocs Maurizio Busca, Florence Ninit, Irina Reginato, Emela Stefanides, here in Nantes, and John, of course, for organizing this wonderful meeting. Yes, indeed, I wanted to continue up on that point and discuss in the first place, let's say, the historical nature of a lot of the questions that have been asked into how the Quran was perceived by, I think, non-Muslims. So we are, to a great extent, we have been talking about, many of the papers have been talking about the perception of the sacred text by a non-Muslim readership, mostly Christian, but also Jewish readership. And in this particular question, you might say that the word European did not really play a role. It was the non-Muslim readership, the perception of the Quran, but not an answer to the question, what then does European Quran mean there? And as such, of course, the question remains, and it was the central question in a sense of the workshop, but also a key notion in the project as a whole, the notion of the European Quran. How can we, that is probably something that we can do also in the future, but is also part of our project program today. How can we theorize European Quran? And then we have to note, of course, that this is not a historical term. As far as I know, and as far as we know for the time being, we don't encounter a concept European Quran in history. It is a scholarly tool which we use to analyze important projects. Nevertheless, I think it is a fruitful concept. And in many ways, what has been done today contributes to the reflections on the European Qur'an. But what might be a challenge, and also I think something that we could do in the future, and we are doing already, in fact, in a volume that we are preparing, and I'm talking here about myself, but our former colleague, still colleague, but postdoc, Gulnaz Sibkutalina, in a volume that we are preparing as a next volume for the series published at the Gruyter. That book that grew out of a conference that we organized in Amsterdam, still at the COVID time, so that was a virtual conference, but nevertheless we succeeded in organizing it, and we are now finalizing the book that grows out of it. And that book focuses on Muslim agency and copies of the Qur'an, translations of the Qur'an made by Muslims in Europe in the time period of our project, in which we have now gathered, amongst others, contributions on Bosnia-Herzegovina, Polish translations of the Qur'an, but also Dagestan and Tatar translation activities of the Qur'an. So we focus in this book on Muslim agency, a Muslim readership of the texts that are produced. And in this sense, for those texts that we are discussing, a Muslim readership is intended and implied. And in that sense, I was also very happy to see that during this conference, Besnik Sinani addressed the same issue in a contribution that focuses on the Albanian translation of the Qur'an, which to me strengthens my idea that we could extend the idea of a European Qur'an, a notion of a European Qur'an as a scholarly tool, not only including the non-Muslim reception, the image of the Qur'an, but also these activities, which, and that is, I think, an interesting thing that was addressed by Besnik Sinani already. There is this, in that translation, there is this very clear reference to Europe as a notion, to Europeans, to being European Muslims, even it's not said. But in that contribution, that European notion means, let's say, a reference that means a sort of movement. It is a modernist movement. But from various contributions in the book that I'm preparing with Gulnaz Sibkutalina, we see that also in an earlier period, you will find that conscience, and you will find notions of cooperation with Christian students of the Qur'an, that influences the way these activities get shape, the translation activities, the interpretation activities. So I think there's a whole world that we can explore in agreement with what we have been doing today, and many other moments in the project, to include these kinds of activities in the framework of a European Qur'an. Then we can go in different directions, in a sense, one of them being the notion of Europeanness, but also, let's say, the borders, and so the notion of Europeanness in the sense of, is European Christian? Is Europe Christian? What are the associations connected to Europe? But also the borders of Europe. What do we include? What do we not include? And the volume we are preparing is an exploration of where these borders can lie. So Dagestan and Tatar Muslims in part of the Russian Empire, are they European Muslims? We ask our readers to consider that, and in that sense to consider Europe as a broader entity, perhaps even including for example, Al-Andalus. The project does not consider, we focus in the project on Christian Iberia, Christian dominated Europe. But if we look closely at what Muslims in Christian territories produce, we cannot deny that there is a very close relationship with the intellectual production of Andalus and a lot of interaction as long as that existed, and the Maghrib. So these are a few things that we may consider for future work and work that we'll do in the project. A last consideration is, we discussed that briefly also today, the word Orientalist. It is used easily for non-Muslim students of the Qur'an and Islam in this period. But what happens if Muslim scholars cooperate with non-Muslim scholars, with Orientalists? Who is the Orientalist there? Who is the humanist there? These are notions with which I at least have been struggling in my work, because there is no real reason to say, well, here you have the humanist and there you have the Muslim scholar. It can go along. The same holds true with difficulties for Orientalism if you define it as the study of Oriental languages. So these are a few considerations that came up and with which I want to conclude. Thank you very much, and I give now the floor back to John.
Thank you very much, Gerard. And we are soon going to let you out into this beautiful spring weather. But before I do so, just a few final words. As I said, as a number of us have said, it's been a wonderful occasion, and it's also a bittersweet occasion because it's the last big event organized by these four postdocs, Emmanuel, Irene, Florence, and Maurizio, together. But as we have said a number of times, we don't let you go once we have you in UQ. And you just talked about Gulnaz, she's a good example. We know that we're going to continue working together. So thanks to the four of you. Thanks, of course, to the ERC. Without the ERC, none of this would have happened. And we were really delighted to have Ines Pugh with us, and delighted you've been with us for the last several days. And we very much hope that you'll be with us again, maybe in Naples, maybe somewhere else. And thanks also to the university and to the MSH, and in particular, special thanks to Gulven, who's done such a wonderful job with the technical side. And special thanks and a round of applause for Amanda. If we could clap loud enough, she'll hear it. And otherwise, thank you to all of you for your presence and for your contributions. And I can just say a bientôt, hasta luego, ci vediamo, see you soon.